welcome back to the channel. So now that the remaster has been out for a few months at this point, I thought it'd be about time for me to go back and go over some of the remaster changes. Obviously, a lot of the changes are sort of renaming things in response to the OGL and that whole deal. But there have been a few classes which have gotten major overhauls which I would like to cover. Starting this week with the Witch. While Witch has had a number of minor changes throughout its class and its feat choices, the major changes to the Witch comes in the forms of reworked patrons. So that's where I'm going to be putting the focus of this video. However, I do want to make a shout out to another change in the remaster, which is the change to refocusing rules. Originally in 2nd edition, in order to refocus, you must have spent at least one focus point since you last regained focus points. What this meant is that if you went into a fight with 3 focus points and spent 2, you could only refocus one of those focus points back, since after you refocused, you would not have spent a focus point since the last time you refocused. Now, in the remaster, characters are allowed to refocus as much as they want without that restriction, meaning that if you go into a fight with 3 focus points and spend all 3, you can still spend 30 minutes to refocus all the way back up to your max. Now this is generally a boon for any character with focus points, but I want to especially call it out for the Witch because of their Cackle focus spell. This is a focus spell that is part of a level 1 feat that many players agree is a quite strong feat to take because it allows you to sustain a spell for free, effectively trading a focus point for an action on your turn, assuming you have a spell you want to sustain. Because of that, you often want to spend multiple focus points per fight as a witch, either cackling multiple times or cackling and casting other focus point spells. Previously, it was sort of difficult to maintain that over a long day, since if you spent more than one focus point in a fight, you would be stuck at that lower max for the rest of the day. However, with the new rules, you can refocus up to your max, enabling you to spend all 3 of your focus points every single fight without that much concern for the long-term sustainability of your focus spells. So now on to the different witch patrons and how they've changed in the remastered. And since Arcus and Nethys has yet to actually add the remaster content to their pool, I will be referencing PathBuilder 2e for the reference material for the remastered witch. First up we have the Curse Patron, which grants Evil Eye and Rave Enfeeblement. Rave Enfeeblement first being a spell that required an attack roll and a fortitude save to determine the effect of your spell on the target. In the remaster, the Curse Patron has been renamed to the Resentment, and Rave Enfeeblement has been renamed to simply Enfeeble and has lost that initial attack roll, a significant buff to the strength of the spell, since now you're only relying on 1 dice roll to determine its effect instead of 2. Evil Eye, on the other hand, was a hex cantrip which frightened an enemy based on the results of its will save, and so long as you sustained the spell, the enemy could not become unfrightened. However, no matter what the result of their save was, they were temporarily immune for a minute, which prevented you from repeatedly casting the cantrip on the same target. In the remaster, it's now a cantrip which inflicts Sicken based on the will save, which is better than Frightened since you have to actually spend actions to reduce it, and notably loses the temporary immunity on cast, which is a pattern that we'll see repeated across all the other focus spells. Additionally, and this one is easier to miss, is that Evil Eye lost the mental trait. Now it only has Curse, Hex, Manipulate, and Witch, whereas before it had Curse, Emotion, Enchantment, Fear, Hex, Mental, and Witch. meaning that now you can give the evil eye to mindless creatures like zombies or slimes. And finally, each patron now has a new familiar ability, which activates whenever you cast or sustain a hex. For the resentment, its familiar ability is that a single creature within 15 feet of it prolongs the duration of any negative effects on it by 1 round, which is an extremely powerful effect. So long as you are casting or sustaining hexes every single round, which as a witch is pretty easy to do, you can keep an enemy permanently debuffed for however long you want. And this is any negative debuff with a duration. So the obvious ones are if your party member intimidates an opponent, you can prolong that frightened condition indefinitely. But it also affects things like if you manage to land a slow spell on an opponent, that will also be prolonged indefinitely. Next we have the Fate Patron, which was an occult patron that granted Nudge Fate and True Strike. Now known as the Spinner of Threads, Fate now grants still Nudge Fate and also Sure Strike, which is just a renamed True Strike, and otherwise has no changes. Nudge Fate in the pre-remaster Witch used to require sustain and gave temporary immunity. In exchange, you could give a target a +1 status bonus to a check, assuming that that was enough to turn the check from a crit fail to a fail or a failure to a success. In the remaster, that effect is unchanged. However, you now no longer need to sustain the spell, making it much easier to just cast willy-nilly on all of your allies, and your allies no longer are temporarily immune, meaning that you can continuously nudge fate on their allies and make sure that things just keep going in their direction. As for its familiar ability, the Spinner of Threads familiar grants a creature within 15 feet of it either a +1 status bonus to its AC or a -1 status penalty to its AC until the start of your next turn, which is just a nice little debuff or buff that you can throw around as you do your normal witchy things. Next up, we have the Fervor Patron, a divine patron which granted Stoke the Heart and Command. And this patron is probably the least changed out of all the patrons. Now known as Faith's Flamekeeper, it still grants command, which was not renamed in the remaster, and Stoke the Heart, which is a small damage buff that you can give to an ally, just loses the temporary immunity. However, like everything else, it does get a familiar ability, and this one grants 2 plus half of your level in temporary HP to a creature within 15 feet of your familiar, which doesn't sound like a ton, but certainly helps in keeping your allies nice and topped up throughout the course of a fight. Next we have the Night Patron, another occult list patron which granted Shroud of Night and Sleep. It is now known as the Starlit Shadow, and its spell has been switched over to Fear, which most people would agree is generally an upgrade over the Sleep spell. Additionally, Shroud of Night was a cantrip which cast darkness over a creature, effectively making everyone else concealed to them unless they had dark vision. In the remaster, this has not only been upgraded to ignore that temporary immunity as we've seen with all the other cantrips, but also to require greater dark vision to bypass, which is much more difficult to come by than just standard dark vision. The Starlit Shadow's familiar ability requires it to be adjacent to a creature which is concealed, hidden, or undetected against, and if it fulfills those conditions, the enemy automatically becomes Frightened 1. Now normally this would be kind of difficult to do, you'd have to fight under the cover of darkness somehow, but the Starlit Shadow's cantrip makes an enemy perceive everyone else as concealed to them, allowing it to set up its own combo and effectively blind an opponent and frighten them all in the same action. Next we have the Rune Patron, an arcane spell list patron which granted Discern Secrets and Magic Weapon. It's now known as the Inscribed One in the remaster, and its spell Magic Weapon has been renamed Runic Weapon and additionally scaled. Where Magic Weapon previously just always made a weapon +1 striking no matter what level it was cast at, Runic Weapon now scales to +2 greater striking at spell rank 6 and +3 major striking at spell rank 9. Well, I'm not sure there's a lot of players out there who would want to spend their 9th level spells on giving an ally a +3 major striking weapon for a minute. It does go a long way in adding longevity and optionality to a spell which kinda got obsoleted at level 3. Discern Secrets, meanwhile, is a cantrip which allows a target to recall knowledge, seek, or sense motive, and gives them a +1 status bonus to that skill that they use for a minute. Now, this is the only cantrip that has actually been entirely unchanged in the remaster. Unlike other cantrips, this one keeps its temporary immunity to discern secrets for 1 minute. And finally, the Inscribed One's familiar ability just grants the familiar the ability to provide flanking for its allies. Now, this is certainly useful, especially if you have a dearth of frontliners in your party. However, familiars are inherently fragile, and even though yours comes back on a daily preparation because you're a witch, it's still going to be difficult to justify sending them into the fray just to provide flanking. Next up, we have the Wild Patron, a primal list patron which granted Wilding Word and one of either Summon Animal or Summon Plant and Fungus. Now known as the Wilding Steward, the spell choice stays the same and the effect of those summon spells has been unchanged in the remaster. However, Wilding Word, the Hex cantrip, used to only be able to target animals, fungi, or plants, severely limiting its usefulness in basically every campaign. Now, Wilding Word is able to target any creature, and if it happens to be an animal, fungus, or plant, it takes an additional -1 penalty to its save, which I think is a very nice buff, but also just generally a much better design. It certainly sucks to have the one thing your patron gives you to be basically irrelevant just because you don't happen to fight a lot of animals, fungi, or plants in your campaign. Its familiar ability grants its familiar your choice of imprecise scent, tremor sense, or wave sense with a range of 60 feet until the start of your next turn, and allows it to immediately point out as a free action. Not only is this useful in combat if you're fighting, for example, invisible foes, this is also the only cantrip that's useful out of combat. So long as you have a friend who's willing to be hit by a casting of Wilding Word, you can grant your familiar 60-foot imprecise scent, tremor sense, or wave sense, which, while 60 foot isn't likely to cover the entire dungeon you're delving, is certainly an enormous range and will easily alert you to anyone that happens to be lurking nearby. And finally, we have the Winter Patron, a primalist patron that granted Clinging Ice and Gust of Wind. And this, along with the earlier Faith's Flamekeeper, is again one of the least changed patrons on this list. Now known as the Silent and Snow, it still grants Gust of Wind, which has been unchanged in the remaster, and still grants Clinging Ice, whose only change is losing that 1 minute temporary immunity as with the other cantrips we've seen so far. For its familiar ability, the Silence of Snow creates a 5-foot burst of difficult terrain centered on its familiar space. This is easily the most lackluster of the familiar abilities. Not only is difficult terrain difficult to take advantage of in general, a 5-foot burst is really quite a small area, and most enemies can pretty easily sidestep it or simply walk through, mostly unaffected. So that's all for this video on the Witch Remaster patron changes. Basically, every patron got an update of some kind of the remaster, with the only exception being the three rare options: Baba Yaga, the Mosquito Witch, and the Pax Witch. In my opinion, for the most part, I think Plaza did a really good job in keeping the sort of flavor and identity of the different patrons, making them unique from one another, but also helping them stand out a little more, and conversely helping the witch stand out a little more in comparison to other spellcasters. Previously, when all you got was a focus spell and a spell in your spellbook you could have learned anyways, it kind of made the witch feel a little less unique compared to something like a wizard or a sorcerer. But now, with the familiar abilities each witch has, not only does it encourage them to play much more aggressively with the familiar, but also forces them to base a lot of their play around their familiar if they want to get the most of the patron benefits that they get as part of their class. So that's all for this video. For the next few videos, I think I'm going to continue covering the different remaster changes, trying to go broad strokes on the major changes in the remaster. So I hope that you'll come back next time when that releases, and I hope that you enjoyed watching this first coverage of the PF2 Remaster. But most importantly, I hope you have a lovely day.